Today we're here at Digital Origin with Stephen and Dan. My name's Costa. I'm one of the cybersecurity consultants at Enable, and we're here to talk about cyber and business resiliency across small businesses and small enterprises. Dan, we've talked about the gaps in these security solutions, but what does real defense in depth look like and actual policies, procedures for small organizations?
Yeah, great question. Often the one that gets overlooked, right? So we talked earlier about leadership being key. In terms of having a strong strategy. I think in terms of this piece, it's about doing the basics very well, okay? So for example, we talked about backups earlier and you're only as good as your last backup. In terms of how often are these tested, right? How often are you doing a tabletop exercise with your heads of department, for example? So in the event of a, huge incident crippling access to your systems and either your Microsoft environment or your servers or your applications useless, who are you going to call? Who are the first people? Where are their details? How are you going to get that message across, not just to your own people, but also to your customers as well, in a clear and cohesive way? Running these exercises, it can be as simple as just putting a basic meeting in the calendar and telling people to leave the laptops and phones outside, and then having a discussion around, we just had an incident, what do you do next? That should, if done properly and relatively straightforwardly, expose the gaps so that you as a business unit team can look to put the improvements in place, hopefully well before you have an actual incident.
One thing that I thought was quite interesting around these tabletops is that the NTSE talk about running these tabletop exercises at least once a year. But what's your view from a Digital Origin perspective? How often do you run these types of simulations with your organizations?
So the ideal is probably twice a year, with once being an absolute no-brainer really. And they only get better with rerunning them. You walk into things and you think, oh, I didn't think about that before. Or this process has changed as well. So that's why it's really important to be doing those. And I also think it's important, as much as the C-suite people need to be involved in those conversations, they need to understand, because as much as you might have all that in place, when crisis hits, kind of rational behavior goes out the window. And so running them so it becomes almost second nature is really important, which is why we look to push them with our clients.
And this is why we see the most battle-hardened SOCs are often the ones providing incident response as opposed to dealing with the day-to-day detection and response. They become the real battle axes in these types of scenarios. But again, if you're a small organization, maybe you've never been through this, back to one of your original points, the experience of a third party to help guide them through that process, identify those gaps and learn from them for the second running of that in the year is a fantastic idea. Actually, come back to a point you made. Testing backups. What does that look like? From my perspective, a backup that hasn't been tested isn't a backup that works as far as I'm concerned. But when you're dealing with these organizations, what type of things are they considering around their backup strategy?
Yeah, good question. So if we're talking backup of servers, for example, is being able to contextualize that for the organization. So when we say we've got a critical line of business application, it's on servers A, B, and C. Have we got the right recovery point objective and recovery time objective strategy in place for that workload? But then what's super important is making sure that the business leaders understand that and they are involved in those conversations, because you might be backing up something once a week. It may be that application or the data that is within that server has now become critical to the organization. Maybe it was part of testing originally and now it's moved into production. And turns out that you're only as good as your last backup, and actually you have the incident on the Monday and the last backup was a week ago. Having the business give the context with the technology teams to understand those points is obviously super critical as well.
And I guess from your experience, how often are the organizations you're dealing with actually testing these backups?
Good question. Probably not enough in most cases. I think technology has come some way to helping with that. So, for example, being able to boot and verify a login window has been hit, for example, being able to make sure that the data isn't corrupt to a certain point that you can't restore from the backup. But again, for me, it comes down to procedure. And how often are they doing it? I think because we operate across multiple different customers in different sectors, some are doing it better than others.
I think it's a really important piece as well around what are you looking to recover? Because the time taken after a breach is the piece that actually kills the business if it doesn't make it back. And so understanding of the servers I've got, which are the critical ones, which ones need to come back online quickly as possible is really important in that whole process as well. You may store those backups in a different environment so they can replicate quicker when you need to call upon them.
And actually, we talked about this again earlier. The NCSC make a very big point of being able to recover at scale whilst going through this type of scenario. If you are having to turn the lights off whilst you recover, then ultimately we can find ourselves in a place where the business ends up failing from it. But you touched on a point there, backups that are potentially kept somewhere else. So we often talk about them from an immutable backup perspective. Again, from your experience, how are your organizations that you support dealing with immutable backups? Is it something they do for everything? Is it only in business critical? Do they still put a tape in a waterproof safe somewhere? What does that look like?
Good question. So I do know customers that do want to be able to put their hand on the data. So they do have some tape backups. I think for me, the bit is that we see is actually have they sat down, to Stephen's point, and gone, what is important? And okay, that is super critical. We do need that air gapped. I think what's happening with technology, as I'm sure you know, Costa, is the technology is allowing you to do this now across most things rather than just the finite ones as well. So yeah, main takeaway is everyone's doing it differently. What is your take from a technology perspective at Enable, and how do you treat the two?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and Enable take the data protection pillar really seriously. We offer a product called Cove. Cove is a SaaS-based backup solution, but what it means ultimately for the customer that's using it is that we are taking the heavy lifting from a backup perspective away from them. So when we talk about immutable copies, it's not configurable, it's not something that can be turned off, it's on by default, and it's something that we do for all data points that are being backed up into that system. So in that true break glass scenario, we have the keys to do the restoration point with that customer. However, the benefit of this being a SaaS-based solution is that we also provide and monitor and secure that solution that is Cove. So the data cabinets that are housing those backups, we are running honeypots on, for example. So we're seeing, to your point earlier, when adversaries target those backups, we're seeing those attacks early on, and we're being able to protect the customers against those. We're doing things like critical configuration change. Somebody internally has their identity breach and tries to change the backup retention policy, remove devices from there. That's all part of the Cove product here so that we can ensure backups are secured first and foremost, and then we can get on to our RPO and RTO times, which actually, again, based on our true data technology, means that we're trying to back up every 15 minutes. So rather than having a recovery point from last week, or in some cases yesteryear, we've actually got a point that was 15 minutes ago. And to even compound that further, we can do all of the testing of the backups as well. We can stand up an image in their environment so they can see that image spun up, the services that we're dependent on, they ran and executed as we were expecting. And our really aggressive roadmap here is we're about to release something called Disaster Recovery as a Service, where we'll even spin up those images in an environment and allow VPN connectivity to them. So an organization doesn't have to wait for a model to be restored. We can just get them straight connected back to their infrastructure. So for us, immutable is one part of that very big data protection puzzle.